Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Sean Stolp. I've been doing bonsai now loosely for about sort of 30 years. I started off with a change of career as a young lad. Things didn't take off, so I did an apprenticeship at a local stately home doing horticulture and forestry. So I've always been around trees. Sort of shortly after that, I left and went into demolition for a few years. And I'd sort of gotten into bonsai, and I can't sort of really remember sort of how it just sort of happened. Sort of stepped away for it for a while, and then about 10 years ago, started up again. I got a new job with a national company that specialised in grounds maintenance and arboreal works. And for the last 10 years, I've worked with them doing arboreal tree felling, tree inspections, and grounds maintenance. And that's pretty much about it, really. And about sort of 6 years ago, 7 years ago maybe, I sort of hounded Mr. Harrington into becoming my friend, and we've sort of gone on adventures from there. So tonight's one is about collecting raw material, Yamadori, which is something that I probably enjoy more than bonsai itself. Everyone has their different sides to it. For me, it is literally finding trees and growing them on. First of all, going through finding trees and permission. Everyone knows the Countryside Act. It is a huge piece of legislation. We all know that naughty collecting goes on, but be warned, should you not have permission for collecting trees, there is no leeway in the legislation. It is set in stone and it is severe. So, you know, be sensible because you're representing the community at whole. The three types of collecting trees, I sort of split them down into categories, which makes things slightly easier. Category one would be the phrase coined by John Nacker, which was urban Yamadori, and in that I would put field grown material. It is exceptionally easy to collect. Gardens tend to be on level with the water plane, the water table. Plenty of nitrates in the soil and lots of broken down leaves and bits and pieces to keep plants healthy. Most trees, even hedgerows and stuff that have been planted, tend to be nursery bought trees. So they're nice compact root balls and they tend to be a little bit more forgiving in collecting. The second sort of one is higher elevation. And we'll get into things later, but it's as you start going higher and higher above sea level, trees take on a totally different perspective of how they grow and what they do, because they're bound by their environment and what they grow in. And then the third one above that would be extreme elevation, which would be like mountain work and high slopes and stuff, which I haven't really done much of. So maybe at another point we could get someone in from like the Wales lot or up in Cumbria or something for the way that they sort of collect trees, which would be an interesting one to watch. The tools that I use is pretty much quite simple. First of all, we start off with spades. Common old garden spades are quite good, but you need something that's strong and robust. I had mine made for me. I had the electric company trenching spade. You can get the thingy spades, these trenching spades that are slightly longer, and I'm not quite into them because I find them quite deep and quite cumbersome to carry around in bits and pieces. I had mine for about 10 years, collected plenty of trees with it, and unfortunately broke it because it was a fiberglass handle. So one of the guys at work did a load of welding for me, and I now have a proper steel the head and a solid steel handle, which can double up as a pry bar as well. Comes in great for lifting trees. Just getting a little bit of lean in that on them, and you can proper get some weight in for digging and cutting roots and stuff. The next one is probably the tool that I use the most, the little mini picks. You can grab these from Screwfix, fiberglass handles, nice and lightweight, and they're probably about sort of 15-20 quid. So it's quite a budget tool really. It comes in useful for lots of bits and pieces. Folding saws, obviously, they're a lot safer. I use the silky saws, which are, I haven't got one down here with me. They're about sort of £20. I always carry two just in case one snaps. Secateurs and wire saws as well. I know they're a big firm favourite at Harry's. You can buy these from most army surplus stores and stuff and on Amazon, and they're just a nice simple sort of wire saws that you can get under roots that are hard to deal with, saw through them, and it gets rid of them. Lots of messing around and damage to roots. The bit that I want to stress the most in the job that I do, where we do lots of forest work and arborist and felling and stuff, I lead the teams. So first aid and health and safety is the utmost paramount. And when you're doing garden removals of trees and stuff, it's not so much an issue. In your car, you should have a first aid kit anyway. But when you're going up onto all the hillsides and bits and pieces like this, even if you're on your own or with friends and stuff, safety is paramount. The weather changes quite quickly, and being disorientated and losing where you are and bits, it does get quite nervous at times. There's plenty of pitfalls or falling over down rabbit holes, hurting yourself. So you should at least carry sort of things like a first aid kit. You can get a simple first aid kit if you go to an arborist store. You'll get a pick one up there for about £20, and they even carry coagulant gels and stuff in it for heavy bleeds and stuff, which it all happens. Always have a backup plan. If you're going off into the countryside and bits and pieces, it's not always well populated with lots of walkers and stuff, and so quite most of the time you will be on your own. Let people know where you're going. And there is this lovely little app that's come out called What 3 Words. It's one that I use quite a lot. It's a bit like Google Earth, and it's used and recognised by all the emergency services. And it was put together by these clever guys in, I think, America, and they've divided up the world into 10-metre square grids. And each one of those grids has been given a specific 3-letter word. And at any point, should you be in danger or have an accident, you can give these to the emergency services and they can pinpoint within 10 metres, which is pretty good, I think. You can also use it for marking where trees are as well. And you can also use it as a point of navigating yourself back to where you left your tree. So yeah, it's got many uses. Get in line with it. I carry scone gloves with me and also a compass. It's nice to know where you've left your car should it get foggy and bits and pieces. Learning how to read a compass, we can't all do it. There's Google tutorials that will let you in on it. It is nice and simple, really, even if it's just to make your way back to a car park. I carry ratchet straps with me. It's always nice to be able to put a ratchet strap onto a tree, tie it off to another one, and just give it a little bit of lean when you're digging to get underneath it. Sometimes it stops wiggling the tree around and damaging roots. Once you get into other bits and pieces, and your rope work might come in handy. Obviously, to learn to tie bow lines and bits and pieces and use safety lines, it's the next step up. Make sure you're confident in it, but it does come in helpful. All right, we'll get on to the main gist of the conversation. Collecting trees is nice and simple. It's not rocket science. It comes down to timing. And what I've tried to do over the last few years is try to be more specific in my timing of collecting trees. I know there's a lot of people that collect all winter. Harry does, and it's on a commercial scale sort of thing, but Harry has the facilities in place of a polytunnel and under-root reheating and certain other bits and pieces that he can use that allow him to collect all winter. I am more specific because I don't have the time due to work and family, so I like to be able to time my collecting to a little bit more accurate, to the point of where you put the trees in pots in the garden. You would have hawthorn in your garden in a pot that's been established for a few years. You want to do a repot, so you're going to sit and wait until those buds get to the right moment, and then you're going to repot it, because that gives it the best success for moving on flawlessly to the next stage of what you're doing. So I try and put this into when I'm collecting. When you're repotting a bonsai tree, you take it out of its pot, you cut the roots, and you can, at most say, remove 50% of the roots. The way wild trees grow, when you dig around the tree, the percentage of roots and viable roots that you remove and take away with you can be as low as 20%, which automatically puts you on the back foot of your care for that tree. So the aim is to collect as much raw material with as much fine root as possible to go as flawlessly from field to a tree pot without any problems. We'll go on to, if you want, root structures. Over the years, there's been lots of bits and pieces about tree roots and that, and there's this whole thing of that tree roots have tap roots and they grow downwards, and what is below the ground is what above ground. In the trainings, what I did on tree inspection, which is what a lot of my knowledge comes from, is that the way trees grow is not like that. Trees are environmental factors, and they depend on their environment as to how they grow. So we'll whack a picture up and we'll go through some bits and pieces. On the left, you can see this is what the typical picture of is what people believe tree roots grow like. On the right, I know there are a lot larger size trees than what we would be dealing with as for bonsai. The side roots was for structural support, and these lateral roots are what support the trees in the way of like a tent is supported. Digging around these trees, now you can see there's not much in the way of tap roots. Tap roots are a seedling thing. There are several trees that do have tap roots, and they're oak, pines and firs and so on. But many of the other trees just don't have tap roots. So what we're getting is you'll have a wide spread of roots that will extend the drip line of a tree. And these will literally lie within the first 30 centimetres of soil, in depth sort of thing. And off of these, you'll get lots of fine feeder roots. And these are the feeder roots, and most of them will grow upwards towards the soil surface, because this is the prime area where there is the utmost oxygen, lots more nutrition that is slowly decaying down, and a lot more water to be found. These are the roots when we're collecting, is that we want to maintain undamaged when we're collecting. Next time you're out in the woodland and you're having a walk around with lots of bigger trees and that, you'll quite often come across trees that have fallen over during to winter weathers and things, and they've got the root ball intact where you've had failure. And you can see underneath that there is really nothing significant in root balls. Tap roots are almost non-existent, apart from a few fine roots really that extend no more down than really a metre. The trees have two sort of functions. It's the tip of the roots to the tip of the leaves. We all sort of know how trees sort of grow. Trees work by osmosis. They work by having a higher concentration of minerals inside the roots to what is in the soil water. As the buds open, the leaves start photosynthesizing, it sets off transpiration, which then helps keeping the osmosis effect going and drawing water at the top, and trees transpire water out of their leaves. The amount of water that they suck up varies from species to species, but in the height of summer, most trees can transport about 300 gallons of water a day. 20% of that is used in photosynthesis and making food for the tree. Trees move a hell of a lot of water to keep themselves going. This is a Spinosa that was cut a few weeks ago. It's not a massive tree, it was about 6 inches across, and it shows you the flow of sap in the spring months. In the centre, you've got the heartwood. After that, you've got the phloem. Then you've got your cambium, and then you've got your bark. The xylem is what moves water upwards and nutrients. It moves up through vessels in the tree that are similar to a sponge under a microscope. These are all full of pits that shift water and keep the pressure down to a lowness so that the tree doesn't collapse. That all goes up to the top of the leaves. It inverts water out of the trees, and then a certain amount of it goes back down to the roots, which helps for feeding bits and pieces. Spring wake up. As in bonsai, everything that we're doing on a yearly basis, we're setting up the tree for the next year. And this works really well because this is what trees do in nature. Everything the tree does in a previous year, particularly coming into autumn, is what is setting the tree up for spring. If you get, trees are dictated by light and darkness. All trees going into autumn is about the length of time of darkness rather than light and temperature, and the same works in spring. The tree senses, it's photoparadisium, I believe it's called, and it is the trees in the buds, in the bark, and in the green parts of the tree are full of loads of little sensors where the tree produces follicron. And this is a light sensing protein that picks up light sensitivity. It is what gives the signals to the buds shut down for winter. The leaves are all wrapped in a hard shell and the cells shrink. Once the night levels get shorter, these then start breaking down. They need a certain period of cold temperature before the tree will wake up again. So as they start breaking down, the tree starts waking up. I generally start doing my collecting around the 20th of March. During the winter times, December, I will go out and I'll be searching hillsides where we're allowed to collect. and cutting back my trees to what I want. I tend to leave the trees slightly higher, and I always leave a bud at the very top that I want the tree to reduce down to eventually, so I can, the hormones are there to keep drawing sap to that point, rather than hoping and praying that it will back bud or throw a shoot shoots out at the top. Leave them a little bit higher, because then it gives you something to grab hold on if you want to wiggle them around in the ground and do whatever to move them about. It saves damaging the stuff that you want to sort of keep. So I do all my cutting in the December time. I have a week off for Christmas. I go out and do some bits and pieces. That way I get no bleeding in the tree. The pits are closed, and all in the springtime when they wake up, the water will be diverted past these and not bleed. So by the time I come and collect them in March, I tend to have several visits up to the hills to try and wait for the exact sort of time that trees are waking up on particular hills. On the hill that we do collect on, one side is shaded and one side is sunny. So I tend to try and break down my collecting into different species and different sides of the hill. The trees on the hills will generally be a week behind the ones that are in my garden, even though they're collected from the same place. I will start on whichever trees that are on the sunny side of the hill, because they'll be waking up first, and then I move over to the other trees and do them last. There is a certain way of digging up the trees. When you're going out and you're looking for sites, get to know your site. The best way of doing that is spending as much time there through the seasons. There's no point going to collect trees that have, you go and collect it in the winter, it's got no leaves on it, and then you dig it up and take it home and it's full of peach curl or bits and pieces like this. So looking at the trees in their environment through the year gives you a better understanding of what's going on, and it also brings you into the areas of a mast year. A mast year is, it happens sort of between every sort of 5 and 10 years, where trees decide that it's environmental, that they have had a really good year, there's been lots of nutrients, lots of sunshine, lots of rainfall and stuff, and so they're going to have a hard push at sowing seeds or fruit. When the trees do this, it is extremely exhausting. Most trees of a certain species, oaks across the whole of Europe, will generally go into a mast year at the same time, depending loosely on how they differ from different environments, sort of thing. The next year when you go to collect that tree, it will be extremely tired, and a lot of the trees that have been collected after a mast year haven't done very well or taken a very, very long time to recover. So observation on these, if you do find an area and it does hit a mast year, just leave them for another year even before cutting back, and just go move on to a different species. There is, most of my tree collecting is done around hawthorn because it's prolific in our area. If you throw a stone in any direction, you'll hit a tree, sort of thing. So yeah, what we're trying to emulate is when you found your tree, you've been and cut it back out of season, and we've gotten into your spring. You go to the site and the buds are starting to swell. When they're first starting to swell, just before the beginning of March, it is, just because it's a swollen bud doesn't mean to say that all the nutrients have moved up into that tree. And just to add, not all of the nutrients in the winter are stored in the soil, in the roots in the soil. In the autumn, the tree sheds most of the water out of its trunk and branches to shut certain items down that aren't needed through the winter, and it just concentrates on the important parts of keeping things active. The roots in winter, yeah, there is bits and pieces. Roots in winter, roots will remain active in winter. I do lots of autumn collecting, and providing that trees will use energy, it sheds water out the trunks and puts antifreeze basically into its system, which will mostly be cells and proteins and a sugary substance, which is just the water, the dehydrated version of what it feeds off. Those are still fueling certain parts of the roots, and it will use the winter time as long as it is above a certain temperature, which is usually about sort of 6 or 7 degrees, and there's no freezing of the soil. Snow doesn't seem to sort of make any sort of problems with it repairing roots, a tree will repair roots, repair the fine hairs, and will also extend to a certain extent. So in a preemptive search for spring for nutrients. The collecting the trees in autumn, and I found it particularly good with beech, that up till sort of about October time I'm collecting beech, almost bare rooting and putting them into soils, and they're going straight into the polytunnel greenhouse, and they are still rooting through the winter because it is kept above 6 degrees. So by the time it comes to the end of the next season, I've literally almost got a full pot of roots. Yeah, to sort of, I'm trying it this year for you to see how they've done with autumn collecting, and so far I'm doing quite well. So anyway, right, back to hawthorn, which is what I'm collecting. Mostly it's around deciduous. Checking out your trees, checking out stability of the trees as well. There is certain amounts of rot. We want some dead wood and bits and pieces and nice interest. You don't want to be collecting trees that are covered in funguses, pests and diseases, rotten wood, bits and pieces, because trying to stabilize and save those white rot and brown rot that are on trees is most of the time just a waste of time. You'll end up with something that will just decay and deteriorate a lot more. Most of the trees that are growing at higher altitude that we collect on are around about, I think it's 857 feet or 860 feet above sea level, which to itself presents a problem because all water, putting aside porous rocks and bits and pieces and other anomalies that happen, all water is on the same level as the sea level. So lakes, rivers and everything else that flows down, you have underwater springs that are obviously another factor into bits and pieces, and rainfall. So on the hills, trees have to find a water source, and the majority of this is rain. Tree roots are environment dependent, so when we go up onto the hills, you won't find a nice spread of roots, perfect taper and bits and pieces. They tend to be just growing wherever they want. They can find the nutrition. A tree is predatory. It is also motherly. It is everything else. They feed on each other. They feed on the dead and decaying. So they take advantage of any sort of nutrients that they can on a hillside and any sort of water. When you found your tree, there's certain elements to look for. One of the key components is most of the trees that we collect are on steep banks with slight little plateaus or where they've had landfalls and bits and pieces. When you find a nice landfall, you'll have more sensible roots that aren't as deep laying. When they're on steep slopes, tree roots tend to grow upwards, up the hills. Not because this is where water is, it's to trap rainwater. The roots are up hills, all the fine fibres go upwards towards the soil surface, and it's the slow rainfall as it falls down the hill. They're not the best for bonsai if you want to stand it upright, but they do make great cascades and everything else, and you can do get some really interesting root balls. It's sometimes difficult to see a tree and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this with it, I'm going to do that with it, until you've got it at home. So anyway, on to cutting. So I do my cutting the trees in December, and then coming to digging. When you come to dig your tree, inspecting the roots and inspecting the base of the trees, where what we would consider to be the nabari, any roots that are above ground to a certain extent that are on show, I always treat as trunk. The roots go into three sections. First of all, the first section will be quite woody, which is what we consider the nabari roots. These will be as hard almost as the trunk of the tree. So when you're sort of saying that, okay, I've got a tree that's 1 metre high, but it's 1 metre across, so I'm going to just dig outside of that, but I've got 0.5 metre of roots that are growing out above the ground, treat those as trunk, because underneath these you won't get that much in the way of fine roots. If you dig wider than these, you can always work backwards, removing any of the roots that you don't want, and still keeping the fine hair roots that you need. Leaf litter. Where the leaf litter falls on a tree is where you're going to find most of the nutrients the feed wants, and it'll tap into this source, whether it's its own leaves or from another tree. On the grasslands, you'll get a little ring of leaves, or you'll get bunches of leaves that build up in other areas and break down or rot in wood. This is an indication of what's going on underground, remembering that we can't sort of see what's going on underground. So the way I like to dig my trees is kind of like an ice cream scoop, where you scoop out a piece of ice cream and you've got a nice just big lump. So I start off with digging probably a good couple of feet away around the tree, all the way around, cutting through any roots that I might hit. You'll find the bigger, thicker roots. And then just outside of that, I will then dig another cut all the way around. And then I will start removing the grasses and putting them to one side and digging down a trench to around about a sort of 1.5 to 2 foot on a medium-sized tree. From that, then I can start working with the pick under the tree until you can start feeling some movement. As you're working around, cutting any of the thicker roots, so you basically free the tree up to give yourself some movement. And what you're trying to do is keep that root ball in the middle nice and intact, so that it doesn't fall apart, and you don't want to tear any of those fine feeder roots. So once you've got some movement, you've obviously got the wire saws at disposal, you've got ratchet straps to pull things over. You can literally just cut the tree out. Once the tree's out of the ground, you can then start working your way back into the soil, removing the dead weight that you don't want to be taking home with all that soil and bits and pieces. Clearing out underneath the tree, and then once you've cleared out, you can cut back the tree to a nice solid state. So you've got nice shorter thick trunks to keep as much fine root as possible. Once doing this, obviously you need to tidy up your site, filling in holes and bits and pieces. Even though you've got permission to dig a place, leaving all the holes and bits and pieces is not good. Stack any bits of branches that you've cut off to one side, leaving everything nice and tidy. You need to check on your site that it's okay for you to remove, if there's sphagnum moss, that it's okay to remove sphagnum to wrap some of the roots in and bits and pieces. Some places sphagnum is protected, other places it's not. It's best to make sure. National Trust, most of the sphagnum sites on their facilities and stuff is protected due to habitats and stuff. We'll go actually to finding sites. It's really difficult to find areas to collect. National Trust, most of theirs are scientific sites, and they won't let you collect trees. I've tried it with quite a few of them, and they're really helpful and understand what we're trying to do, but by law they just literally can't help. The HS2, people have lots of different feelings on HS2. I personally was hoping that it was going to be access to lots of hedgerows and stuff, but it seems to have just sort of come down to there's been so much protesting and just crap going on that they literally won't even let you on most of the sites anymore. One of the best things that I found is I'm on, with my job where I tend to travel around quite a lot in the county, is I'm on a lot of the villages on their Facebook pages, which is always a good lead for finding trees, because there's always at the minute lots of house building going on, and you'll always have someone complaining and moaning about a housing development that's going up, and it is always then a really good place to find hedgerows that are being taken out. A lot of my trees come from there. I also have a lot of access to woodlands and forests through work, and lots of hedgerows obviously that we remove different species and bits and pieces. The amount of privets and things that I have found literally sat on the side of the road is unbelievable, and they are literally bomb-proof. Yeah, it's literally skips and everything. So yeah, it's basically just putting the word out there. I've tried over the years, I did a small Facebook page where I was offering a tree removal service for anyone in the local area that had anything in their garden they wanted out, conifers and bits and pieces, and it just ended up with people wanting doing free chainsaw work, basically, massive great big trees wanting felling. So, you know, give it a try, it might be worth it in your area, sort of thing. Collecting trees is more fun if you've got friends, honest to God, it is. We've had some great laughs up on the hills, and it is, you know, bonsai should be a lot more social than what it has been, sort of thing. I know everyone's run the bits and pieces, and their collecting sites are secrets and stuff, especially mine. But yeah, you know, there are places that you can collect with friends and share alike. And the way we do it is that there's a couple of us that share the same hillside, and we literally tag out trees that we're going to collect for ourselves, and respect that. If you're going on to woodland where it is shared collected with people that are not in your circle, respect it if they're tag trees. That is nothing more annoying than working on the tree and going back to collect it and someone else has taken it. It has happened a few times to me, and it's not even people that I sort of know or have been supposed to have been on my hill as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, it does happen. So yeah, avoid it. So anyway, yeah, right, back to digging up. So we've dug up our tree. Trees do the most stupid things at times, and they literally just grow all over the place. I've had trees that have had what I thought were fantastic Navaris, dug them out the ground and roots have literally wrapped around themselves, or you've got other species that you think is the root from that tree and it's not, it's from a different tree. By the time you start to bare root your tree, most of it you will lose in roots that belong to other trees, especially if they're in close-knit communities sort of thing, little groups and clumps of trees and stuff. Should you be cutting through the trees next to it, you know, just put some sphagnum moss on the cuts and stuff and cover them back in to sort of help them on their way. Once you start collecting a tree, you have a responsibility to collect that tree. Halfway digging through it and then not collecting it, there's no excuse for it really, because if it's on the hillside, it is going to sort of deteriorate fast and die. I prep a certain amount of trees in winter. Sometimes I don't get around to all of them, because obviously where I collect in that small window of opportunity to give it them as best chance as possible. Sometimes I just don't have time to get to a tree, or it's gone too far to collect. So I did once try going back and collecting the next spring from trees at a higher elevation, and the trees failed. The way I put it down to was that the trees are on the hillside and they are living right on the edge sometimes, and they are not extending any vegetative growth. They are literally just flowering spurs that just have ring upon ring upon ring upon ring, and they can be 3, 4, 5 inches long, some of the flowering spurs that are on the trees. Once you cut it back and it has to go into vegetative growth, a year sometimes is not enough for that to put enough energy back into the balance of the tree to make it collectible on the next year. And you would be far better leaving it 2 or 3 years before attempting to collect the tree again. When I collect, I want to do as little as possible with that tree. I want to remove as big a root ball as possible with as much fine root as possible, get it home, get it into a suitable substrate. We'll go into substrates in a minute, and get it into its position so that I don't have to move that tree all summer. I don't want to be going, oh, it's in a little bit too much sun there, so I'm going to move it to the other side of the garden where it gets a bit more shaded, or oh, I'm going to turn it around, I'm going to do this, that, and the other. Because every time you rattle that tree around in the pot, that fine root that is put out to make itself a little bit healthier, you could break that root, and it could be that moment between that tree failing, struggling, or dying. It comes down to a little bit of thinking, and the way that I do things and the way that I think is come from a lot of failures. It happens to everyone. Not every tree makes it. Yeah, so I got a tree out of the ground, bagged it up. I tend to bag everything up into black bin bags. If you can collect sphagnum moss, whack them on the big cuts. Take the bags up to secure the root ball as much as possible. The last thing you want is anything falling off on the way down and rattling around and breaking those valuable roots that you've collected. Get them home. When I get them home, I can't always repot the trees that night. Most of the time, because of work, I sort of tend to go collecting on a Friday or a Sunday afternoon. Friday evenings, I finish work at about sort of 4 o'clock, and I sort of come home and I'm already packed, and I just get changed and I'm straight off up to the hill. So normally by the time I get off the hill, due to family and work sort of thing, it is getting dark. So I bring my trees home, and my trees go straight into willow water. It's something that people have talked about for long times, and Harry got me started on it. I have green chunks of willow. You put them in the water and they produce, I think it's like an aspirin type fluid from them, and the water goes quite slimy and sticky, and this has an antibacterial and a healing properties to it. I also chop up little bundles of in barley, the little bags, the fish pond bags of sphagnum moss that goes into the water as well, and it sits that water. I use that same water all winter. So the trees go into that, and I generally repot them the next day. I bare root them carefully, anything that's left on it, but I never wash the roots. What is left on the roots, where we collect off of chalk and flint or grasslands, which is quite an acidic soil. I think it's sort of about a 5.5 to 6.5 pH. So you're bringing the tree back from an acidic environment to put into non-organic soil. Trees can adapt quickly, but it's very difficult. So I try and make the transition a lot easier than what it should be, sort of thing, and so far it seems to be working. So yeah, the next day I repot, and I use in my mixes, I use large grain pumice, which is neutral pH, lava, and sometimes I've started now using a little bit of akadama. Into the mix I then add pine bark, which is slightly acidic, which then brings the tree back a little bit closer to the environment that it's come from. I never wash the roots, so they're taking with them that little bit of funguses and mycorrhizomes that are on the roots and stuff and that with them, which gives them a little bit of a healthier start, sort of thing. You can buy mycorrhizomes. I generally just get mine from the garden centre in the little packets that you add into the thingies and stuff. I've later been told that they are different kinds of mycorrhizomes, you get different sorts, but so far it's working. My pots seem to be filling up, and so yeah, I'm still having good results with it, so I still sort of use it. The trees that are wired into baskets, I tend to use the big bread baskets because I get more airflow and a bigger pot that is nice and tight in, if that makes sense, because I collect quite a large root ball. I'll do some pictures in a minute. Bending of roots, to squeeze it, we have this little problem of that you don't want a tree in a pot that's too big, and because obviously it's not going to use wet water and it's a wet, cold environment. So you want a pot that is not much bigger than the actual root ball that you're putting in there. Bending of roots, to get them into a pot, all you're doing is squashing the live veins and the pits that are in the sections of the tree that supply nutrients to and from and water. So not only is a tree having to deal with putting back new roots, it's also having to realign channels in the tree, and you're just making those roots work a little bit harder. You'd be far better off cutting back to a fine hair root than leaving it long and bending the root. I've had roots, just through experience, that where they have been bent and put into a pot, and for some reason, might be right, might be wrong, but they haven't rooted as well, even though they're on a strong live vein. Due to bending, the roots further back have rooted thicker and stronger. So yeah, once they're in the pots, they then go into plastic bags. Photoparadisium is the series of where trees react to light. All seeds have it as a genetic thing inside them, that they have light sensors that help them to go into autumn and then come out in spring. And like I said, across the road from me, I have a large hawthorn hedge that all comes into leaf into different stages, and trees are dependent on shorter darkness to show them off into spring. It starts them off rather than light and temperature in the daytime. So it's the shorter nights rather than the longer day that brings the tree into spring. The trees across the road in the hedgerow, the ones under the street lights, always come into leaf 2 weeks later than the trees in between, and this is due to the lights. So the black bags, I think it was the Spanish, I think it was, or the Italians that started using the black bag method. Where trees invert water to keep themselves and cool themselves down and bits and pieces, when they go into the black bags, they obviously, it gets very humid and very sweaty inside there. So it means that they don't have to invert as much water. Also, it puts into play the photoprodisium active in a tree that it believes, that I believe it is, that it's been buried or that it is sat shaded under another tree, which is what forces the tree to push growth. Everything, the pot and the plant, all potted up into black plastic bags. I get the Tesco's wheelie bin bags. I think they're sort of like 120 litres, 50 litres. They're massive, great big things, and I can get a crate and a pretty big tree inside it. We can't keep them in the black bags forever. After they have started extending and growth is getting to the point that it is a nice lush green and you're getting a couple of inches of extension, they need to start coming out because they obviously need light. Trees see in different light spectrums, and obviously the bags are on the floor, so the top of the bags, the black bags, will let a certain amount of light that will come through the plastic. So the trees will grow towards that light. Once they need to come out of these bags, if they are still not strong enough, they can go into clear plastic. And I have found a great way of getting clear plastic bags. If you go along to any of the furniture shops, DFS and bits and pieces like that, or if you know anyone that's having a double bed delivered and things like this, literally say to them, I want the plastic packaging. These bags are super strong and they are monstrous. Do you know what I mean? Some of the trees that I've collected, you've needed them, and they absolutely work brilliant. And I mean, I'll show you some pictures in a minute of a tree that I just took some pictures of last year and collected. And it's a raft, and it's a very special tree because you do not get rafts down here in the soft south, simple as. It's not the best, but it is mine. I collected it and I'm going to love it to bits. So yeah. So yeah, the other thing is feeding. In the first year, I don't feed any of my trees. They literally get rhizotonic. And then when we go on with this, you can always, there's many products. I'm not endorsing anyone's products, but I use the Kaizen Green Dream premium seaweed extract. The only reason I use that is I trust Graham. Anything that he sells, it might be of whatever different product that he packages it up. It's not my business. It's just I trust in everything he says, and I know that every bottle that I buy is going to be the same formula. There's loads of other seaweeds and bits and pieces out there, and I'm sure they're all just as good. I work on trust in life, and that's it. So yeah, you can also use it as a foliar spray, which really greens up lots of the trees, and it does help. Later on towards the end of the season, I might, if the tree's really strong, get some of the granular organic green dream and water it down in into water, so it's almost a liquid, and feed with them to the point of, if the tree reacts badly to it, I can flush it through quite quick. If it's too strong for it, sort of thing. But I tend to do it at a lower dose, not even half of what it should be, sort of thing. In the clear plastic, I've left trees in the clear plastic literally all the way up to the end of May. It doesn't seem to do them any harm, as long as they're in a sort of semi-shaded position. I used to have the polytunnel, which I obviously haven't anymore. I have a 9-year-old daughter that now decides that she loves tomatoes. So the polytunnel went because it wasn't being used for the summer months. We've now got a greenhouse. So I insulate the greenhouse with the polyfoam fibre boards they use for new builds for the insulation. Everything's all put in there in the winter. The sides are all insulated off, and all the trees are put on boards through anything that's collected on winters to keep them off the concrete floor, to keep the roots warmer. Obviously, in the summer, they come out, they go into plastic bags and bits and pieces, and then Isabel gets the greenhouse. So yeah, when they're coming out of plastic bags, obviously you need to acclimatise the trees to their environment. When you first take them out of a bag, they will limp. It normally happens in the first sort of 12 hours for a day, and then they'll pick up again. That saying of where you've got a tree and you go out and look at it, and then you go out the next day and it's grown, and you sort of go, oh my God, that's grown overnight. Trees literally grow overnight. They store up all this energy up in the daytime, and then at night in the darkness, that is when they put it all to play and they start growing. So if you're going to take the trees out of the plastic, do it a little bit at a time and do it at night. That is your best friend, and it will acclimatise a lot quicker with a lot less stress. We'll go on to some pictures. Here's a tree I found last year that obviously was on the hillside, and it was a nice raft. So obviously in December, I went back and cut the tree back. And these are the cuts. This is the tree after I'd finished cutting it back. As you can see, I've left lots of branches on there that have got lots of buds, because buds make roots, but not too many to make the roots work too hard. So obviously I went back March the 20th last year. The tree was dug up and brought home, and the process that I said of digging a trench around the tree and then working inwards once I've gone underneath the tree, so it's lifted out as one big huge root ball. And once you've done that, you can then start working back into the tree, cutting back any of the thicker roots back to a fine root. And on that process of doing it, of like a larger root ball, you're collecting, as you can see, there is a hell of a lot of fine feeder roots there to support the tree. Those feeder roots, unwashed, should beat the tree as a transition from soil to inorganics and into the summer flawlessly. And that is what I want. It's like I said before, I don't want to be messing around moving trees around. Trees pretty much get moved twice in the summer. They're collected, go into bags. If it's going to be cold, they go in the greenhouse. They're then taken out of the greenhouse and into the clear plastic bags, and they go onto a bench on the side of the garden that gets, the sun comes up behind them. So the tops of the trees get the sunlight. The roots are in shaded spots that keeps them nice and cool, but they're still at the ambient temperature of the air. And so far it's worked really well. I've had no problems with dieback. I've had better rooting. The pine bark, most of the trees do not root into the pumice or the lava rock. Most of the time they root into the pine bark. Harry and I, it was Harry's idea in the first place to start brewing soils. And it is basically preparing soils for your season's collecting, but you're preparing them the season before. I started off with buying bags of pine bark. And what I used to do is open the bags up, soak them down with water, seal them back up, and just leave them at the side of the garden in a really sunny spot. And they would literally just cook inside the bags. And that pine bark would start breaking down. But whilst that's breaking down, that would naturally, you can also tip some rhizotonic on it and bits and pieces like that. They would start breaking down, and you'd have all the funguses and all the mycorrhizomes and stuff would start growing in there in bits and pieces. So by the time you've dug your tree and you're mixing up your soil with these ones that are a year old, they have already started kicking off a sort of like environment. We all know the whole difficulty of taking a tree from a wild environment and putting it into a non-organic soil. It is a big leap that trees in its own right would take millions of years for it to be able to develop into different soils and stuff. So sort of making it as friendly as possible. So yeah, so we started off on the of basically rotting down or starting the rot of pine bark because of its acidity to sort of bring them back into a more settled environment sort of thing. And it sort of just went from there. And I mean, I was opening bags up and there was flies in it, mushrooms, all sorts of stuff, and just banging them in there. And when we're then repotting the trees after a couple of years of them growing, literally most of the roots have rooted into the chunks of pine bark rather than the lava or pumice. The lava and pumice creates loads of air and oxygen that goes through. They hold nutrients and so on, but the trees are preferring the pine bark as a source of nutrition. Big vats of pre-mixed soils that are just literally cooking away in the sun with everything going into them, bits and pieces and stuff. I reuse all of my substrates from a failed tree or just a repot of a tree going from a crate into a training pot or so. All those soils are sieved and reused again because they're not virgin soils, to say as speak. And I'm finding the trees are recovering, whether it's my collecting techniques have got better or whether it is the soils. It's an open-ended question sort of thing. But I have found that the trees have settled and gone onto the next stage quicker and a lot happier and a lot less stress-free sort of thing. Timing wise with trees, I tend to collect a tree, and especially with hawthorn, that once you've got to pass your year of it being in a pot, the tree will be growing nice and strongly, hopefully. And if you're keeping that tree or selling that tree or whatever you're doing, but if you're keeping that tree, you can start working on the top, nice and gentle. Leave the roots alone. I would never repot hawthorn unless it is growing strongly. The third year, probably, of being in a pot. You will, well, we've had it all said before, you know, the longer you leave it and let those roots grow, the shorter space of time it will be before you take that tree to its next stage of development. If you repot it too quickly, you're losing and whittling away at that energy that's stored in the sort of tree and that you're building up. So sort of 3 years, I'd give it 3 years, don't touch the roots. Smaller trees, obviously, they settle down a lot quicker than the bigger, older trees. There's some pictures that I put together of the raft that I collected. I showed you some of it in the ground, and the roots sort of thing. Let's have a look at the roots again. As you can see, the roots are cut back. The roots before this was cut back, the thicker roots were probably 3 times that length before I cut back. That was the size of the root ball that I did on this tree. The drip line of the tree was quite broad from when I cut the tree back. So I worked back on the tree. A hawthorn that I had that I collected 3 years previously with the same techniques, and it was repotted this year. The pine bark basically breaks down almost completely, and you can see in this the amount of fine rooting and bits and pieces that's going on in a tree 3 years later. It's just absolutely alive. Now we have the tree. I brought it in so everyone can have a look. Let's go and see. This is the tree 1 year later, after the tree collecting and soil sciences. It is nice and healthy. I don't know if you can see it in there. And we'll do some working on it on the top of the tree at some points this year. And hopefully another 2 years, I can start moving it over into a smaller training pot and taking it on from there. Any questions?
Sean, when you're collecting, when you bring the stuff back home and you're using the plastic bag method, which is the light and the humidity, how beneficial is it to have heat underneath?
Harry uses heating cables. I never have. I did try the method of putting them on polystyrene to try and keep warmth in, but all I found was that if we had a heavy frost, they tended to freeze, and any water that was in the pots rose to the top. The heating under thing definitely does work. Obviously, if you're autumn collecting, which is almost another talk sort of thing, and autumn collecting is something that I've done lots of, especially on beach. I've not had, I think over the past 4 years, I collected, I think it was 22 beach, and only had 1 failure, which is pretty good odds, really. Underfloor heating, under sort of pot heating, I think it's viable. I don't think it's needed at this time of year. In the spring collecting, I don't really think it's needed. But if you're collecting through the season or in autumn, then I think it is well worth the investment. Just to add to it, my collecting period, I sort of didn't put it in there. I collect, obviously, like I was saying about timing on trees. I didn't bring it up with me, but there was the tree that's behind me. I cut one of the small branches off when I cut some back. And I cut one back 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and just laid it on the bench at the back in the shade sort of thing. And I was looking at it yesterday. I didn't really mean to bring it up, and it shows you the whole thing of that where buds are swelling and people go, oh yeah, Jeremy, that's it, we can start repotting now. That is sometimes not always the energy moving the tree. That is just the cells breaking down and the buds pumping full of energy, it's not necessarily signs of that it's ready to be repotted. And that twig that I cut off, the buds are creamy yellow and still plumping up, even though they're not connected to anything. All it is just residual energy that is in the branch itself that is making that look like it is ready to be done, which is why I now start collecting later in the season. I start generally around about 20th of March, and I will finish on the hillside where we are by the beginning of April, sort of thing. If it's cool, not frozen, then I could probably collect going into April. But I have another site which is a thick clay soil. It's a slag heap basically of an old clay pit where all the discarded soils are now, and it's now partially a lake sort of thing. In the summertime, it is dry and cracked clay soil. It is really hard digging, and in the winter, it's basically a foot of water. So by the time you get into April and the early teens of April, it's dry enough to sort of walk on. And on there are lots of very, very small hawthorn with great bark. And these have a taproot because obviously in the summertime, they need to go quite deep to get water. But off of those taproots, you get lots of little lateral roots and stuff. And I'm still digging those up towards the end of April, whilst they've literally burst bud and you've got the first sprout of leaves. And I'm digging them up, cutting the taproot back to laterals and potting them up. And they're still going on and not even skipping a beat. It's trial and error on some sites and bits and pieces on how they react. I wouldn't do it as much on a hillside where the trees are struggling, or an older tree, but these are slightly younger trees that have just looked older. Does that make sense? But obviously they are really, really pumped with water, and their roots react at different times of the year to how the water table is. So at that time of year when I'm collecting them, they're still in very wet soil and still pumping lots of water. If it was a drier soil, I would leave them alone and collect in autumn or something like that. But yeah, it's trial and error. You need to get to know your site. That is the best way of collecting trees. And start off, if you're new to collecting, with younger trees that tend to be a little bit less forgiving at sort of mistakes and bits and pieces, and then working your way up to the older bits and pieces.
What brand of pine bark are you using, and what sizes are they?
I'm using the Melcourt, and it's normally about 6 mil. But as you're rotting it down in the bag, they get 6 to 16 mil, which is sort of like a 50p piece size, most of them. But because it's the scales, when you put them you soak them in water and put the isotonic on, they start breaking down. So sometimes it's almost dust that you're putting in, or centimetre square sort of pieces. And it doesn't seem to make any difference. It's not clogging up the soil. I use it at about sort of 20%.
What can you say about collecting pines, when to do it, right? You talked about deciduous.
Yeah. I don't do a lot of conifer. I've done quite a few pines. I've had really good success with collecting in August. And I've collected pines through to October, but they've always gone into protection, as in i.e. the polytunnel or bits and pieces. The October one I've still got. It was a big old pine that came off of a hillside, and the other ones were woodland pines. They were collected mid-August. You get plenty of rain and a warm, humid temperature. The few pines that I collected all made it, actually, yeah.
I don't have any success collecting earlier in the year.
Yeah, the pines, yeah, definitely. I would go for the August. You're looking for, when the humidity in the air is up high, you get those quite wet days where the trees pump up and it's quite warm and wet. And that is an ideal time that I've had quite good success. I did collect one in, what was it? They put it in some of the older books. It's as soon as the snows break, you collect your deciduous and then you move on to spruce and pine. And I remember doing one then, and it sort of literally just died a slow death over a few months, sort of thing. Whether it's inexperience at the time, I don't know. But yeah, I sort of have more confidence now in collecting in August. To the point, actually, I even repot a couple of the pines that I've got in pots and that in August as well.
Where's this magic hill you keep talking about? A few different.
I have three hills that I'm collecting from. And although they are not that far from each other, I mean, it's quite a drive to get to them, as though they're not actually that far. There's probably about sort of 20 miles in between them all. The trees differ on all three hills, not just in the quality of the trees, but also in the way they root. It's just craziness. I mean, the whole picture of how, I mean, you know, we all know that trees that root like in a parkland where it's all nice and you get a nice even root spread of these big old oaks and bits and pieces like that. When you get onto a hillside, anything can and does happen. It is just craziness. But you know, some
animals and stuff.
Well, not just animals. It's, you know, the trees will grow to their environment, so you very rarely get a really nice root ball sort of thing, as in a nice spread of roots. But that is the joy of Yamadori trees. It's those little special sort of bits and pieces. And many of the trees that you can have multiple fronts to them. So yeah, but because the hills are quite dry and they're quite open to the wind, the deadwood that we're getting on trees is just absolutely rock solid. So yeah, careful digging, that's what it comes down to, and getting to know your site. And every site will be different, but it's still the same formula that you're using for digging and collecting. I do enjoy collecting nice flat places, but it's, if you want the better trees, higher elevation is your key. And that is exactly what I went for, is literally Google Earth, my environment, what is the tallest places, can I collect there? No. Okay, what's the next best thing? Do you know what I mean? And it's literally then just spending time knocking on doors. Most of the time, people, when you knock on their door and say, yo, can I come and collect some trees from your backfield, they just sort of think that you're going to rip them off. And there's just some sort of thing in it. But, you know, if you take books along with you or bits and pieces and just chat to people, you'll find them quite helpful at times. And a couple of bottles of wine or something like that doesn't go amiss. I'm yet to have much luck on knocking on someone's door and say, excuse me, can I have it at your front garden? I tend to get shooed away. I think I'm a bit of a criminal most of the time. But there you go. I found one house that has got this absolutely phenomenal juniper in its front garden, and it's the only tree there, and it is just been cut back and cut back, and it is just a massive taper and deadwood, and it is beautiful. And the bloke keeps telling me to F off all the time because I've harassed him so much. So I think some flowers and chocolates to his wife might be an idea or something, because I want this tree. I've been trying for about 5 years now, but hopefully we'll sell the house and move, and then that'll be it. So, but yeah, but don't give up hope.
When you're up on the hills and you're digging stuff up, are you air layering stuff as well at the same time?
No, I move on to air layers. I've done quite a lot in the last few years. I came across a very special hedgerow full of some absolutely fantastically amazing elm. I start my air layering slightly earlier. Most people go on to, I think it is sort of end of April, May, once trees are in full leaf and bits and pieces. With elm, I'm literally starting my air layering early April, before the buds are properly sort of hardened off and stuff, and working on a better air layer. That's what I've been doing the last 3 years. I've been using, rather than just using sphagnum moss, I'm soaking sphagnum moss in isotonic and adding to it perlite as a mix, and small bits of pine bark that has also been rotted down, and doing, rather than a tight plastic around the cut, I'm doing a larger bag that sits just underneath the cut. So rather than getting a big tight swirl of roots over the year, it's more spread, so that there's less invasion of the roots once you finally cut it and get it to move it into a soil, which sort of puts you that little bit step further to developing an abari sort of thing. Air layering, I love air layering. I used to see it as a bit of a cheat, but now it's not. It is development of a really, really good tree. So yeah, I sort of start quite early.
Those air layers in the wild, are you watering them, going up there and watering them?
I sort of do the perlite and sphagnum moss mix, and I sort of tape the bags on at the bottom, and then they're folded up over the tree, so they're sort of like a tear shape, and then you tape at the top, so there's a little bit of a sag just below the cut, and that acts as like a reservoir where it will fill with water. I've only tried it with elms so far. So I mean, elms are extremely thirsty and they root extremely easily. The first year that I did it with a tighter root ball, I was going back and watering probably every month with a syringe, just injecting each one. And it gets a bit monotonous because I think I was 18 air layers in like 100 meters of hedge, and that's a lot of hours, and it was a 30-mile drive round trip sort of thing to get to them. So I sort of moved towards this new way of doing an air layer. And last year's doing it where the bags are slightly sagged and it collects that water, and the top, it's taped up tight, but not too tight, so that any rainwater can drip down into there as well. I didn't water all year.
Do you attach the moss wet, do you? Is it wet?
Yeah, the moss is absolutely wringing wet. It comes literally straight out of the bucket of water. I soak it all in a massive, I collect my moss from a special site that I'm allowed to collect. And I literally go there and collect like 3 or 4 bin bags full of moss from different banks to allow bits and pieces to grow back, sort of thing. I mean, this stuff is literally like a foot deep growing up trees. It's enormous. Bring it home, and I have loads of big buckets with lids, sling it all in the buckets, fill it with water, put a lid on it. 2 or 3 days later, any seeds and any insects have drowned and floated to the top, and you can scoop these off, and it's then good enough to use. To that, I then add perlite and rhizotonic and leave them to brew for a couple of days, and then I go out and do my air layers. And like I said, where the bag is sort of sagged, so it's like a teardrop, and that just sort of acts as a little well, and they're sort of coming out as really, really good. And I didn't have to water all season. So when I went back and cut, I sort of about sort of September time, beginning of September, when they're just starting to yellow off and die back, sort of thing, I go and cut them and then bring them back home. And most of these have got that little bit of green in it, means that there's still a little bit of energy and residue in the trunks. They then get potted up into pumice and pine bark again, and then they all go into the greenhouse, and they will sit in there through the winter. And once they've gone into absolute dormancy in the December time, I then cut them back, as many of the branches off that I don't want, sort of bits and pieces, to whatever design, leaving as much to bud, sort of thing, to give it some energy. And then that's it. The next spring, they're just left alone. And so far, not lost a single tree. I collected, it must be about 30 elms over the last 3 years. And literally every single one of them have sold. I've got 2 trees that I kept for myself, and that was it. Had great success with crab apples as well, doing the same thing. Although I do find that I'm needing to water the crab apples a lot more. I don't know why. It's because they're smaller trunks that I can't get. Air layering in the countryside is difficult, especially if they're in a built-up sort of area, or it's a dog walking past and stuff. I've done them in the past, and I tend to sort of come back and people have ripped them open because they're nosy to see what they are. But yeah, just to add to it, I wrap them then, they're in clear plastic, and then it's black plastic on the outside. We did do one with talking about tin foil as well on the inside to help try and insulate with heat and things. But I honestly can't see it doing much difference. I know they use tin foil in like the States and Florida and that, where it's quite hot with tropical plants and things. But I don't know how well it'd work here, or whether it'll make any difference. Yes, urban Yamadori, that's what it comes under. Urban Yamadori is the same principle of a dig, except it is a lot easier. The trees tend to be a lot healthier, and you tend to get a lot better root ball, sort of thing. It might not be an ideal Nabari, but they seem to be a lot stronger. They live the easy life.
You were talking about using water that willow been soaked in it. I've got in the garden 250 kilo drums that I fill with a hose and leave them to breathe, and then I water can from that to trees. Would it be beneficial to bundle a load of it up and sink it to the bottom of one of those drums and just leave it down there to soak in a barrel that you're going to use for general watering? I
think the cut willow, the water that it makes, it is good for anything you've repotted where there's some cuts. It helps in healing and helping calluses, or keeps the calluses open for the hormones to root, sort of thing. I don't see the benefit of watering your average tree that's been on the bench and not repotted for a couple of years. I don't know if it'll make any difference, or sort of thing. I don't know, maybe it's something to try and just see what the results are. But generally we just use it for newly dug trees or repotted trees.
Just going on with what Mark said about the willow. I actually put willow in a bucket and let it grow, because the enzymes that you need come off the roots, not off the actual trunk itself. So it's actually the roots that produce the enzyme. And I use them on my air layers. So I use that water to soak the sphagnum or whatever I do. But I've started using pots. So instead of using a bag, I actually use an open flower pot with the same, a very similar mix to you use. But instead of pine bark, I'll actually use compost because it gives you that little bit of water retention.
Yeah.
And I use the willow water, and I find it works quite well.
Do you cover the top of the pots?
No.
No.
No, leave them open.
Ah. See, I've seen it done with pots.
Because every time it rains, it then waters it for you.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of a conjecture about whether you should keep it warm and temperature-wise, but I just use black plastic pots.
Yeah.
And,
I think it depends on species. I mean, obviously, I'm doing elms, which just root in anything. Harder to root species, I don't know. I've not sort of really tried. I've done a few sort of maples and stuff, but not for bonsai, just for sort of propagation for garden material sort of stuff.
I did it with a yew, and it worked. The first year, the roots were just like very thick white nodules.
Yeah.
And then I left it alone, and the second year, it just filled the pot with roots.
When did you start on a yew, an air layer?
It was at the beginning of the year, because I normally start air layering towards the middle of April. So as soon as the buds start to open, the leaves starting to show, then I go from April through to July. I mean, I've air laid right the way through to August, but
yeah. Do you insulate in the winter?
Yeah, so if it's really late, I mean, sometimes I just leave them on until the spring, but most times I just then give them a bit more protection because the roots are that much. The later in the year, the more careful we have to be. But,
I'm yet to try you, but it's something I intend to do. And Spinosa this year, hopefully. I found some nice Spinosa. So
yeah. Well, I'm trying to air layer things that you're not supposed to air layer. So I've got larch and black pine and things like that.
Try it. Do you know what I mean? What's to lose? You know what I mean?
Exactly. I've got to cut the top off, so I might as well air layer it.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's the thing about Mark with your willow water. Just get some long stems and put them in let them grow actually in your bucket.
Right. So I wouldn't put them in my water, but I'd grow them separately and then transfer the water to my water bucket.
No, just cut them. If you go up near in Shepperton Way on the Thames, they actually grow willow for making willow features, so arches and animals, etc., and they coppice it. So if you go anywhere, any council, they will actually coppice willow. It's because they crown lift it. So and it's just those stems, and all you do is you just literally just stand them in your bucket, and then they'll just grow away, and all the roots just will fill the bucket, and it's that does the good. They get very fine roots, and they root really quickly.
It's Tony Moore. Can I ask? I've got a blue cedar in my garden. It's probably about 20 years old. I want to air layer it. What are my chances?
Honestly, I wouldn't know. I've never tried one.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely zero.
Oh.
If you want a rough guide, if a tree will take from a cutting, it'll do an air layer. Roughly, it doesn't apply for everything.
Okay.
But that's a fair basis for it. You can't sort of root cedar cuttings successfully that I'm aware of.
I'll try it anyway.
Yeah, give it a go. As Sean said, give it a go.
Yeah.
And everyone gets lucky once in a while. I keep being told you can't air layer an oak, but it's a deciduous, so you must be able to. So it's one of the things that I intend to try. I think you get greater success with bits and pieces like that with most of the junipers, and conifer species, where the strength of the tree is in the roots. Leaving a branch below where you're trying to air layer or do a tourniquet continuously keeps feeding the roots. If you do it below any of the light growth, you're starving the roots. So greater success might come about if you've got to leave a branch below that can still feed. With a lot of the conifers and junipers that are root dominant sort of thing, where all their strength is in the roots, like pines and most of the sabinas and bits and pieces like that, if you're air layering off of them, leaving the lower branch, that will continuously keep feeding the roots. Because when you cut the bark, you're blocking that supply of photosynthesized energy and stuff that's going back down to the roots. If you've got a branch below it, it keeps feeding the roots, otherwise the roots will die.
I think no one's got any more questions. Sean, you got anything else to say?
There's loads. It's a big subject. Timing. That's what it all comes down to. Timing and knowing your area. So hopefully that was quite clear. I know I did waffle quite a bit.
It's good to hear it all though from someone that does it on a very regular basis. I think with Brexit and the sourcing trees from abroad, etc., etc., it's going to become a bigger thing. Yamadori and homegrown trees. It's that's where the future strongly lies, isn't it? I think
native species is the way forward. It is the best way. Do you know what I mean? Yep. In my opinion, we don't grow Japanese bonsai. We grow British bonsai, and it's a totally different class of tree. And our native species are just overlooked, most definitely. I think that's about it. We sort of covered everything else. Thank you very much for listening.